Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Mishpatim. We continue our discussion of Sinai with a focus on the negative aspects foreshadowed even at the climactic moment of revelation. We survey the Rabbinic tradition as preserved in our texts and surprisingly in the Koran. Finally, we wonder whether Israel and God have entered into a relationship at Sinai that neither one can resist. So join us for Shadows of Sinai continued. Well, welcome back. I made you promise at the end of last week that we would return to this subject. Little did I know that we would return in the following week. I guess it's the giving of the Torah at Sinai is a big deal.
A very big deal, and they come back to it at the end of this week's portion. And I mean, there's a question exactly why this is placed at the end of this week's portion rather than the last week's portion. But whatever it is, it's like bookended, so that the last story is about the giving of the Torah. So that's exciting. We get to have it for 2 weeks in a row.
Absolutely. And before we begin, every so often we get comments from people that listen to the podcast. And I thought maybe I would quote just a few comments that we got in the last week. And what I want to do is encourage all of you who listen to this as a podcast to give us a few stars and maybe to write a comment on whether it's Apple or Spotify or whatever platform you use to listen to our podcast. So Howard writes, kudos, another interesting Torah study. Although I wonder if left-handed individuals would agree with the rabbi that to the right is always better. Rabbi, I think you pissed off the left-handed people.
Yeah, that's funny. Okay.
I was happy to see the sketch of the shul at Gvodvich. My great-grandfather Morris Gnobel was born in Gvodvich. The synagogue is now in the Ukraine in the Carpathian Mountains, almost at the junction of Slovakia, Poland, and Ukraine. Thank you, Howard. Michael wrote, I woke up feeling the beauty of encircling the mountain, like passing the talking stick in circle, holding sacred space. And may I add, climbing the mountain to reach God's outstretched hand as a metaphor for our lives. And the opposing negdo. Yes, there is always creating the illusion of separation, split from the divine. Thank you. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Howard, and it's loyal listeners like you that make this all worthwhile. So we are continuing last week, and in this week's Parsha, as you say, after the Parsha is called Mishpatim, it has many rules and laws that are relevant even till today. One of them has to do with hitting a woman who miscarries, and lo and behold, that is the source of so much of the discussion about abortion and right to life and so forth and so on. But in Exodus 24:4, it says, Moses then wrote down all the commandments of God. Early in the morning, he set up an altar at the foot of the mountain, Vayiven Mizbeach Tachet Hahar, with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he took the record of the covenant and read it aloud to the people, and they said, all that God has spoken, we will faithfully do. That is Everett Fox's translation of Naaseh v'nishma. The JPS says, literally, we will do and obey. The Koran Jerusalem Bible says, they said, all that the Lord has said, we will do and obey. So Naaseh v'nishma is something that I grew up with. You probably grew up with, Rabbi. It was the crowning, bumper sticker of the Jewish people at Sinai. They said, Naaseh, we will do, v'nishma, and we will listen, or possibly we shall observe. And we talked last week about this sense of being underneath the mountain. We focused on the positive aspects of that. Today we're going to focus on maybe some of the negative, foreshadowing negative aspects of it. But if you go to the Midrash Tanchuma, it really does connect both this standing under the mountain and what the Jews said underneath the mountain. It says, the Israelites did not accept the Torah until the Holy One, blessed be He, arched the mountain over them like a vessel. As it is said, and this is last week's Parsha, and they stood beneath the mountain. Rabbi Dimi, the son of Chama, stated that the Holy One, blessed be He, told Israel, if you accept the Torah, well and good, but if not, your grave will be there. If you should say that He arched the mountain over them because of the written law, isn't it true that as soon as He said to them, will you accept the Torah, they all responded, we will do and hear. And the Midrash Tanchuma goes on to say the first explanation that we have of what exactly we will do and we will hear is we will do relates to the written law, and we will hear seems to point towards listening to the oral law going forward. But whatever it is, we talked about this kind of this ambiguity about the giving of the Torah. Whether it's the ambiguity of being under the mountain, is it something that was more like a wedding canopy, or was it something to be fearful of? If you don't accept it, I will destroy you. This Naaseh v'nishma that we all think of in terms of, as we'll see some of the positive commentaries, as a very positive thing, it lends itself to so many explanations. So what's it all about, Rabbi?
Well, first, let me comment on the first explanation that you gave. Naaseh v'nishma. It's going to be the written Torah and the oral Torah. That's very interesting just in the history of law, because law is a combination of the written and the oral tradition. It's interesting that today that's not really true. If you want to know what is American law, if a lawyer goes to law school, they study the Constitution. Then post-Constitution, there are case law about what the Constitution meant. And there are 250 years worth of case law about the Constitution. Everything is written down. Just a question of whether it's the Constitution or whether it's the explanation of the Constitution. But 4,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, it didn't work that way. You had a written tradition, then you had an oral tradition. The truth of the matter is that all three of the religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all have that idea. They have a written text, right? You mentioned the Koran before. They have a written text, and then they have an oral tradition. The problem with the oral tradition is, how can you convince people that the oral tradition is authentic the way that the written tradition is authentic? And what the rabbis do is, and it's a little trick because the rabbis are actually authenticating their own tradition. But what they say is Naaseh v'nishma. It's the written tradition and it's the oral tradition. Our tradition was taught by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. It wasn't written down for whatever reason, but it was taught to Moses on Mount Sinai, and therefore it's just as authentic as the written tradition. That's a very important kind of statement by the rabbis to authenticate the oral tradition. Without that, the oral tradition, which is everything, right? There are 39 categories of work that are forbidden on Shabbat. That is not in the Torah. That is the oral tradition. How do we know that that's true? There's a certain amount of faith that goes along with it. The rabbis are reading it into the text.
So I totally agree with you. I think the Rashbam says something beautiful that takes this concept of oral tradition out of the very technical sense of what we call the Mishnah and the Talmud. And he says that we will do what God has said already, And we are also prepared to listen, obey to what he will command from here on in. Mikan lahaba unekayem. And I think what that is saying more than anything else is it's not so much that the oral tradition was given in parallel to the written tradition, but the oral tradition shows that whatever was given was the beginning of a conversation. And that if we take away anything from last week and this week, it is that revelation did not happen in just a moment and just a place, but that it was a beginning of a conversation. And I love that concept of it. And I think that kind of really jives very well with what you were saying, because the oral tradition was always living and always developing. And we'll see that about the oral traditions about the giving of the Torah at Sinai.
Yeah, there's no question that that's right. I mean, and we understand why that's so important. I mean, the whole Torah is important and the whole Torah is interesting. But somehow when you talk about the written Torah and the oral Torah, you're talking about something that really is at the foundation of all of the traditions that we have.
So let's get to the traditional interpretation of Na'aseh V'Nishma, because definitely it is that bumper sticker that I described before, which is used as an accolade for the Jewish people. And the truth is, the simplest explanation comes not as an accolade, but almost as an insult. In Ketubot 112a, it talks a story about Rabbi Zera was going to come back to the land of Israel, and he needed a ferry to cross. So he took hold of a rope that was strung against a bridge, and a certain Tzeduki, said to him, "Hasty people who put your mouths before your ears." So basically he was cutting line. He was in a hurry to get across the river. And the Tzeduki says, "You guys are hasty. You put your mouths before your ears." And what he meant to say was that when the Jews accepted the Torah, they said, "Nasa, let's do and we'll listen afterwards." You know, it's like shoot first, ask questions later. I think that is the typical explanation of why the Jews pride themselves with saying Na'aseh V'Nishma. They had such faith in God that they said, "We're going to do it," and then you can tell us the fine print. We're in. We're committed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you 100% on that. I think that's 100% correct. I mean, that's really, it needs both pieces. Without both pieces, something is missing.
You could, however, see it as criticism. I mean, the Tzeduki definitely saw it as critical, where he was saying, what sort of an acceptance is that when you accept a contract without reading it? So even here, it's a backhanded compliment, if you will. But let's just finish the traditional explanation of it being a compliment. In Shabbat 88a, it says, Rabbi Sinai taught, when Israel accorded precedence to the declaration, "we will do," over the declaration, "we will hear," 600,000 ministering angels came and tied 2 crowns to each and every member of the Jewish people, one corresponding to "we will do," one corresponding to "we will hear." But then it goes on. And when the people sinned with the golden calf, 1,200,000 angels of destruction descended and removed the crowns from the people, as it is said. So talk about backhanded compliments. On the one hand, again, this is seen as an amazing showing of faith. But we will now go through multiple midrashim, multiple oral traditions that talk about the hypocrisy almost of Na'aseh V'Nishma. Here this people says we will do, and then we'll understand later. And then 15 minutes later, maybe it's 30 days later, they sin with the golden calf. And maybe that proves that the Sadducee was right. Maybe their acceptance was very superficial.
Good. That is an interesting point. And that is, why are they sinning so quickly after they're saying we will, Na'aseh V'Nishma, we will do and we will listen? Something's wrong with we will do and we will listen. So yet you started by saying, what's the traditional explanation? Clearly, the traditional explanation is that it shows total commitment to God to be able to say we will do and we will listen, even though they didn't have it yet. That's what you just called the traditional explanation. The question is whether, but what's interesting is that the rabbis don't seem to be satisfied with the traditional explanation. They understand that it's kind of the double-edged sword, and they emphasize that, which is interesting because they understand that the Jews in the desert are not just a simple, law-abiding, God-abiding people. They're a very complicated people, and they try to see that in the phrase "Naaseh v'nishma."
Complicated people and a complicated moment. It really punctures the myth of this importance of the giving of the Torah at Sinai as this hyper important moment that began and ended at Sinai. Even at the end of this Talmud, it says, "In the future, the Holy One, blessed be He, will return them to us, as He has said." And it talks about, quoting Isaiah, that Berina v'simcha olim al rosham, that with joy and singing, Zion, I will return this to your heads. It almost is as if the rest of Jewish history is trying to make up and to fulfill the promise of the revelation at Sinai.
And if that's so, that would be a good thing. It says that every day you're supposed to feel as if you received the Torah that day. You're supposed to wake up and you're supposed to have the energy and the excitement as if you're receiving the Torah that day. And what you're doing is you're adding to that. And you're saying it's not only you receive the Torah, but that you're part of this evolution of the tradition that goes from generation to generation, that continues. So it's not only that you receive the Torah in the sense of the Ten Commandments, it's that you receive the written and the oral tradition together.
The oral tradition and maybe even the written tradition wasn't fully accepted. There's a real challenge here. I think that the giving of the Torah at Sinai becomes almost a challenge. And if we go to the most traditional account of this sense that the mountain was held over them, and it says, if you accept the Torah, excellent, and if not, this will be your burial. Rab Abba Bar Yaakov in Shabbat 88a says, this is a major cavit, a puncture, a major dent in this sense of having the Torah given at Sinai. And this is the punchline, and I don't know if it's because this year we have the holidays are late or early, but we are, 2 weeks away, 3 weeks away from Purim. This is the famous piece of Talmud. As far as I can tell, it only really occurs once, and it says that in the Megillat Esther, it says in Esther 9:27, the Jews undertook and irrevocably obligated themselves and their descendants and all who might join them. Kimu v'kiblu aleim v'al zaram v'al kol hanidvir aleim. Of course, then it goes on to observe the 2 days in the manner prescribed. But the rabbis say, and this is radical, that it was after Purim, and you can either say Purim is just a holiday like any other, or you can say that Purim in the book of Esther is the last book of the written Torah. They accepted the Torah in full without a mountain held over their heads. So this Rabbi says, finally, at the time of Achashverosh, it says, and the Jews accepted what they had already taken themselves through coercion at Sinai, they accepted in free will. So I think at the most basic level, what it really proves is what we started out by saying, is that accepting the Torah doesn't happen in one day. It's a process. It happens over time. And what they say is that the caveats and the dents in the acceptance of the Torah at Sinai were finally somehow completed at the last book of the Torah when the Jews kimu v'kiblu aleim, accepted upon themselves. And that's the kind of the end of this story of this mountain held over their head. What do you make of that?
So, you're emphasizing the fact that the verse comes from the book of Esther. You could say that that's just out of convenience. The rabbis are looking for a verse to kind of hook this on, and they find a verse in the book of Esther. So that's interesting. I never made much of that verse in the book of Esther because, I'm not, because they kind of take that verse out of context. But you're actually saying something that's even better. And that is that because the book of Esther is the latest or a late book in the canonization of the Bible. We're talking about, the Bible from 900, and here you have the canonization, the decision that the Bible looks the way it does, that there are 24 books in the Bible and no more, that this is the end. And only at the end did they actually accept the Torah willingly. So the beginning of the process is, and let's be honest, that's the way we are as people, right? Sometimes you have to be pushed to do something, and only later are you happy about it. And maybe that's what happened with the Jews. Maybe that's the point. That's the point that you're making. Maybe that's the point of this piece of Talmud. And that is that at the beginning they had to be pushed. But the key is that later on, at the end, they came to appreciate it. How about that?
I love them all. And I think, as we always say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of God. That, if anything, is the message here. That is the message that we're getting. I mean, in the source sheet, I quote something else. Yes, last week we talked about the words of how the Jews were oriented. There's another word that is used, and that is that they stood, yetzivah. And it says, from here we learn that in 3 places the Torah was given, in the tent of meeting, at Sinai, in the plains of Moab. My point is that the rabbis clearly saw revelation as something that happened in every generation, in every human being's life, at every moment, at every time. It was an ongoing process. And I think that's the most important thing. And this is a big and that it's not as though we are trying to somehow parallel, to somehow duplicate a perfect process that happened at Sinai. Because guess what? It wasn't perfect. To the contrary, it was fatally flawed. I think that comes through almost every piece of Talmud that we will study and the Midrash that we will study tonight. There's no one who quotes Nasa v'nishma who doesn't say but afterwards.
Yeah, that's correct. And I mean, and what you're saying is, I think correctly so, is that that's part of the tradition, to say Na'aseh v'nishma and then to say but.
I mean, even last week, I was trying to keep the conversation very positive about the mountain being held over. And I said, it's kind of like a chuppah. And it even had likrat in it, like we have likrat to greet the Sabbath bride.
Right.
Rabbi Shimon ben Khalifa said, wretched is the bride who sins under the wedding canopy in this regard. There was no rabbi who could look at what they said and not see a level of hypocrisy and not see a level of superficiality and be critical. And that's an amazing part of our tradition. I think if you have to think in terms of revelation at Sinai, that is our Jewish aha moment. That is the moment that we were exposed to the divine message that gave us the Torah that is going to go on sale at Sotheby's for $50 million. I mean, that was the moment, and it's not sugar-coated. I think that's amazing. The other part of that moment that we can never forget was it wasn't a singular moment between God and a single individual. It was the whole expanse of the Jewish people with all their flaws. And I think that this is helping us understand, the magic of that moment.
Yeah, that's an important point. The rabbis say that the entire world was quiet when God gave the Ten Commandments to the Jews. And that's an important point. God gave it to the Jews, but everybody else stood back and watched, so that everybody knows that God has chosen the Jews. That's a very powerful moment.
So I want to prepare us for something that's rather unique, and that is that while many of us have never heard of this midrash, that God held the mountain of Sinai over the Jewish people as almost a threat, it figures rather large within the Koran. And we are going to go to the Koran in a second and quote it. But before I do, I want to go over some of our midrashim who really twist and turn and go into all of the different ways that one can understand what happened there. In Midrash Tanchuma, it stood at Mount Sinai, it resembled grapes. Just as grapes are beautiful on the outside and ugly on the inside, so was Israel when it stood at Mount Sinai and responded, "We will do and obey." Note, the response was with their mouth, but with their heart was not steadfast. There is other midrashim that compare the Jewish people to a wife. We've kind of seen that when we talk about the Har Kegigit, this mountain held over their head as a chuppah, and there are verses that said that the Jews picked, God picked the Jewish people, and it says in Echa Rabbah, "I am the man who has seen affliction by the rods of his fury," and that is from Lamentations. And it says, "No woman except you other than me." So it kind of talks about this dialectic between God, and you've kind of hinted about this, God offering the Torah to all the peoples, and none of them would say anything close to Nasa v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. But the Jewish people did. And then God realizes that this woman who he just kiviyachol married has cheated on him. She has built this golden calf, and God says, "You have been impudent." And at the end of the day, like a married couple who is destined to be together, the midrash continues that almost in a sense, and I talk about this in the introduction about how they're almost destined to be close together. She lied in order to get him. He fell for the lie, but he fell in love, and here they are destined to dance this dance of faithfulness and infidelity. It's really amazing if you look at the source sheet and look at all of the different ways that the Jews by saying, or the Israelites by saying Nasa v'nishma, but then sinning right afterwards, are crafted. But I think what ultimately remains is that nonetheless there is this relationship between the two, whether God was fleeced or not. Ultimately, the two of them stick together, and I think that also is a message of this story of the revelation at Sinai.
I think that is true. Now you're raising an interesting question, and that is you're kind of introducing God as the player here. What did God decide? What did God want? God. Let's go back to the first Gemara. We'll end where we started. The first Gemara about holding the mountain over them. Did God feel like that was a necessity, but it wasn't ideal? Or did God think, no, that's okay? That's what the people need. The same way a parent might need to be a little firmer with a child to make sure they do the right thing, but they understand that's just what the child needs. It's not a bad thing. So how do you understand that about holding the mountain over them? Was that what God wanted to do, or that was a necessity that God felt that he was forced to do?
We don't have an answer for that. I promised last week to talk to the Koran. I'm gonna do it this week. So
Here you go. Take it away.
I read an amazing article that was written. Oh my goodness! It was written. It's called Koran and Agadah. It was written in 1941 by Julian Obermann, and literally he brings the Koran says in Koran Surah 5:7. Remember Allah's favor upon you and his covenant which he made with you when he said, "We have heard and we obey." In Koran Surah 24:51, he says the only response of the true believers when they are called to Allah and his messenger, so he may judge between them, is to say, "We hear and obey." Then in Koran Surah 2:63, it says, remember when we took a covenant from you and raised the mountain above you, saying, hold firmly to the scripture. In Koran 4:154, we raised the mountain over them as a warning for breaking their covenant. So clearly, and the point of the article is that Muhammad, whenever he quotes from the Bible, always quotes typically from the Chumash, which is what traditional Orthodox Jews do when they're in synagogue on a typical Saturday. And for the most part, he doesn't quote the literal verse. He quotes the Midrashic, the Aggadic interpretation. And the thesis is that he hung out with Jews. And in a sense, we almost get a sense of what he heard. This is something that clearly made a great impression on him. And as he was starting a movement, he wanted to make sure that his revelation was accepted in the proper way. He says in Quran 4:46, some Jews take words out of context and say we listen and we disobey. Now that is not something that I found in the Midrash, although if you look in the source sheet in Avodah Zorah, there is something similar. The fact is that the Quran then becomes not only a source for us of the Midrashim that were quoted by typical Jews in Saudi Arabia, in wherever he was, but it gives us a sense of our tradition. It gives us a sense of this ongoing revelation that clearly, in a sense, it's only natural that a movement like Islam, a movement like Christianity, would take upon itself to make a new Sermon on the Mount, a new revelation. We Jews clearly took it to mean that in every generation, whether it's on Ahasuerus in Shushan, or even up to today, this is the Jewish problem. And that's where I end. I talk about two thinkers, and I adjure you to look at the source sheet. One is Herzl, who was trying to solve the Jewish problem. And what he considered the Jewish problem was, yes, there was anti-Semitism, but how does a Jew live with his Judaism when he loves it? And his first solution, believe it or not, was a mass conversion, similar to standing at Mount Sinai, but in front of the cathedral. And then, of course, his second solution was to start the State of Israel. And Harry Austin Wolfson wrote a whole essay leaving Judaism. And he struggles. Here's a Jew who studied at Slobodka, who ended up not being religious anymore, but clearly he couldn't get out under the shadow of Sinai. And he spent the rest of his life pursuing the philosophy of Judaism and how it went through the medieval period up to Spinoza. But he talks about this challenge. And I think that is ultimately the challenge of Sinai, that we are constantly being provoked by the fact that we had in our DNA, in our peoplehood, this mass revelation of something that has affected us, that we've rebelled against, but we've tried to master throughout the ages. And I think that ultimately is the magic of the shadow of Sinai.
I think that's great. That's a great end. That's an end with the Koran. That's an end with Herzl. That's an end with Wolfson. I mean, that's just amazing. There's so much. And if you look at Wolfson, you'll see that he has a great discussion about the role of the minority, right? That he says all these religions, the three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were all minorities. And how did they deal with being minorities? And they needed that moment of revelation where God spoke just to them. Even though they were a minority, God spoke just to them. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. These are great sources. We got 2 weeks in a row of Mount Sinai sources and trying to understand the tradition. It deserves a whole semester's worth. But these were great sources. So thank you, Geoffrey. Shabbat shalom to everybody. We look forward to seeing you next week. It'll already be Chodesh Adar. And we're going to start to talk about the tabernacle, Geoffrey. We're going to have our work cut out for us next week.
Shabbat shalom. Have a great
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat.
And be well.
Any of you who want to make a comment or provide an impression, I would love for you to come up.
Good, Geoffrey. It's a wonderful teaching today. You sort of took away the teaching from last week that I was celebrating on the chuppah explanation, but I understand. But I have a couple of questions. Could the Jews have been a dynamic people if they didn't disobey? Is that the whole part of this? Is that they initially said we hear and we will obey, but they didn't obey. They used their own free will to change things, and then this behavior pattern became part of the living example of what the Torah talks about. Is that we may disobey, we may go against the norm, but then we learn and we come back to it. I don't know whether you think that's a relevant observation or not. And the second question I had is, why did 600,000 angels come down initially, but then they send twice the amount down to take back what had been given? That's always confused me.
Wow, two great questions. So first of all, I really think, although none of the traditional commentaries have made the connection to Ezer Kenegdo that I did last week about this dynamic between any couple, any relationship, where if you deserve it, they are a helpmate, and if you don't, they are negdo, against you. I think ultimately what so fascinates me and what so enthralls me and makes me love our tradition so much is that truly, even at this moment of revelation, I mean, when can you get a moment where it shouldn't be pristine, where it shouldn't be perfect? You would think it would be at that moment of revelation. That's our birth of the Savior moment. That's our, Muhammad goes up to heaven moment. And here we have within it all of these conflicts and these dualities. And I think that is this dynamism of neged, of being opposed to, being part of this relationship. And you really, at the end of the day, see, and I touched upon this, the relationship with between the people of Israel and God is definitely it's one that neither party can get out of. They are wrapped in this relationship, and they cheat, or they are God. I always say the word kiviachol. It's the way a religious Jew talks about when we anthropomorphize about God. But here it is, in very human terms, that he was snowed by his loved one, but nonetheless, he's still in love. Or she's still in love. And I think, yes, that is what makes this tradition so powerful. And I think from a certain element, clearly Muhammad, or at least the Koran that accounts for Muhammad, was very impressed by this. This really made an impression on him. Or the flip side of that is he walked away from the synagogue he was in. Now, maybe he just came on an odd Shabbat and it was Yitro or Mishpatim, and he heard a good sermon, but clearly this made an impression on him. This was his takeaway about the Jewish people and how they accepted their prophet, how they accepted their holy writ. And I think it is a bumper sticker. It is a badge of courage for us. And ultimately, yes, wouldn't it be nice if it was as simple as the Jewish people underneath a chuppah? But marriage is not that simple. Relationships are not that simple. And our relation with our text, our relation with our tradition is clearly not that simple. And I think it's profound. About the 600,000. So you could say that the 600,000 was either that the angels, when they came down, they had two crowns and they put the two crowns on. And when they left, maybe the crowns were heavier, maybe there was less joy. So they needed an angel for each crown. The 1,000,002 is always kind of mentioned when it talks about all the Jewish people. So maybe it's making reference to that. I don't have a sure answer for you. I think it's a great question, and there's no reason why whoever wrote that midrash and whoever carried it on and retained that part to it, there was a twinkle in their eye, and they wanted us to have this discussion.
You're probably right about that. It's I'm not sure that Muhammad though would. I'm a little bit. I'm starting to study the Islamic part of it now. I'm not sure that Muhammad would have been as accepting, that his takeaway would have that this was something to celebrate, because his interpretation and the way that he impacted the community, he was quite an authoritarian, and I don't know whether or not the celebration of the Jews emerging from who they thought they were to who they were to become was as open of a topic for him as you're suggesting. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think the most amazing verse that I quoted from the Koran was Koran 4:46. It says, "Some Jews take words out of context and say, 'We listen and we disobey.'" Who are these Jews? Did he walk into a synagogue of people who were saying, "We listen and we disobey"? I mean, there's so much there. I mean, a Jew who wants to disobey, does he really say that? Is he quoting the midrash? Is he flipping the midrash? I think you're probably right about Muhammad, and maybe in a sense he is preserving a joke that he didn't get. He is preserving an attitude that he didn't quite get. But clearly, if in fact he ever heard that, he must have heard that in a traditional setting because people were talking about the law. And it's a fascinating midrash right there that Jews would say, we will listen and we will disobey, was how they caricatured the Jews at Sinai. I just think it's fascinating, and I love it when the Abrahamic traditions play with each other's midrashim and traditions, and potentially what we can learn from that. So anyway, I think I agree with you. Although, obviously, when we study a testament like the New Testament or the Koran, we don't know about the historical Jesus or the historical Muhammad any more than we know about the historical Moses. But it is a text that is fascinating, and I think adds to our reading of our own texts.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful, wonderful teaching today.
Rabbi Yochanan.
Hi, Rabbi Geoffrey and Lauren and everyone in the room. I have a story about the ideas that you were talking today, and I want to ask you, how many minutes do you give me for my story?
The mic is yours.
Okay. So, in Moscow, in the 1920s, died the chief rabbi of Moscow, Rabbi Maza. And in about when was this? In the 1890s. I think this was in the 1890s. There was a group of Shas, a group of studying Talmud, opened in Moscow, and they made an event for the opening event, and there was a famous rabbi from the Musar movement, one of the founders of the Musar movement. His name was Rabbi Itzele Peterburger, Rabbi Itzele Blazer, or in English you would say Rab Isaac Blower. This was his name. The Maskilim in his time hated him very much. The greatest Hebrew poet of the time, Yehuda Leib Gordon, who is known as Yalag, wrote about Rav Blazer in his poem, criticized him and mocked him in his poem, in his poetry. And this famous rabbi, Rav Blazer, was in Moscow at the time, and he was giving a speech at this event. And in his speech, he was saying that he was quoting this Gemara that you quoted today, that God was he put the Mount Sinai on top of the Israelites, and he told them, if you take the Torah, is good, if you accept the Torah. If not, what will happen? If not, there you will have your burial, right?
Mm-hmm.
So after he finished his speech, Rabbi Maza, who was a modern rabbi, gave his speech. And he gave a long speech, but in the end of his speech, he made a comment about Rav Blazer's talk. And he said like this, but I'm going to make a short version of it because I don't want to go into the whole length. But basically, he said he cannot agree to this Agadah, because we Jews, we did not accept the Torah by force, and because we are not Marranos, and like the Marranos in Spain who accepted Christianity by force. Mm-hmm. But he said we are not Marranos. We were never Marranos. And then he said, just in the previous hour, we were davening Ma'ariv. We were doing the prayer of Ma'ariv in here. And what did we say during Ma'ariv? We said, Umalchuto beratzon kiblu alehem. What's the meaning of that? It means the Israelites accepted the kingdom of God beratzon, with willingness, right? With desire. So this is the opposite, beratzon velo be'ones, meaning with willingness and not by force. So he said this Agadah must be among the Agadas that is not real, or it's metaphoric, because it comes in contradiction to all the other sources that we have. And in the end, he said that even in this Agadah, we can have actually a different interpretation. So he said, God should have said, if you don't accept the Torah, then you will be buried here under the mountain. But it doesn't say here. It doesn't say here it will be your burial. It says there will be your burial. Why does it say there and not here? So Rabbi Maza says it doesn't mean that you will be buried here under the mountain. No, it means throughout the thousands of years that is going to come in front of you guys, you should always keep the Torah and the morality of the Torah. Because if you step away from the morality of the Torah, there will be your burial. What's the meaning of there? It means in 1,000 years from now, if you step away from the morality of Torah, your burial would come by itself there, wherever you step away from the right path of the Torah, of the morality, but not here under the mountain. Got it? After he finished the whole speech, Rav Blazer, the old Rav Blazer, Rabbi Blazer, the old-fashioned rabbi, came to him, and he told him, "My son, my son, you had a victory on me. Your interpretation is matchy for a gadol, for a real gadol, and it's every word you said was true and pure and kosher. Yasher koach, and I'm done.
Well, that is wonderful. It's all based on Sham Tehei Kavua Techem. There will be your grave there, and I think it in a sense resonates with what we were saying, that the revelation at Sinai was not at one moment. It was ongoing throughout the generations. And so if the revelation was ongoing throughout the generations, then what Rav Mezer was saying was that so was the threat. Ongoing throughout the generations. It's at any moment. It's kind of, it's like this Greek myth of the sword hanging over you, the knife hanging over you. It's always there. It emphasizes that revelation at Sinai is something that's ongoing, and it has to affect us every moment. The potential danger has to affect us at every moment. We have to take these ideas seriously, because if we don't, we could be buried here. I think that's very powerful. That's a wonderful, wonderful story. Thank you so much for sharing. So thank you, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you all next week.